Now turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 4, and I want to read this morning verses 18 through 22 with Jesus calling his disciples. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed him. I want you to notice how quickly after Jesus begins preaching in Galilee, he recruits his own disciples. There are four of them right here. Jesus recruits them from fishing. In the ancient world, particularly here in Galilee, fishing was very important for the economic sustenance of the culture and everything in the fishing industry that went around it. You know, you've often heard that fishermen were kind of low on the economic scale and they weren't respected that much, but that's not really the fullest picture. So many things were involved and connected with the fishing industry around Galilee. So much so that there were fishing guilds that were created. And you had to be a part of that. You couldn't just go out and fish on your own and then show up in the marketplace and sell. You know, you had to have the right connections with the government. Also, local government gathered lots of levies and fees and taxes. What we don't realize is how many fishermen kind of lived from week to week, day to day, because of all of the fees and taxes they had to pay that would grant them the privilege to fish. So it wasn't an easy life. Another thing I learned is quite interesting is there were a lot of what we would call kinship companies, family-owned fishing companies. That's why it's not strange when you see Jesus walking along and he sees two brothers fishing together, and then he sees two more, they're in the boat with their father working on the net. That was very typical. Families that were involved in fishing, their whole family was. The father would train the son to be fishermen. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. What we're going to find is that this becomes a significant model for discipleship. That there is the answer to a call, and there is growing that must follow. You must learn how to be a disciple. And we'll talk about that process in a moment. But here we see Jesus, the fisher of all men, training others to be fishers of men. A number of years ago, I think Nancy went through it too. We were at a congregation where there was a program that someone came in and trained us to be fishers of men, where you could have Bible studies with people one-on-one. Well, that's one way to be fishers of men. We'll talk about the different ways that we can fish in just a moment. But in Galilee, with fishermen, there was a recognized technique for fishing. And you may remember on one occasion when the disciples are fishing in the boat and they see Jesus and they realize that it's him, but he says, you know, the story said they've been fishing all night, hadn't caught anything. And guess what Jesus says? Well, if you'll throw your net on the other side of the boat, you'll catch something. They couldn't hardly drag the net into the boat, and then came back to land and, of course, you know, opened up the net. But that's how they fished. They would fish with nets, and usually around the edge of these big nets would be sometimes stones or something, little ones, but it would weigh it down. So there was a technique that you could gather it all up, and with one arm, you could sling it way out there, and it would go out in a big circle, and then it would land. And these stones out on the edge would make the net kind of go down, it would sink down, and it would wrap the fish in it. That's when they would pull it in. So there was a real interesting technique that you would have to learn. Well, I can tell you right now, because I haven't learned that, it would not be a pretty picture if I tried to gather up a net myself and throw it out in the lake and try to catch fish. I haven't been trained. Well, you have to know how to do it. And of course, sons working with their father, that became second nature for them. That's what they learned. That's how they knew how to fish. So when we look at Jesus being the ultimate fisher of men, he also is going to, as a good fisherman would, have a goal of catching some men, and 11 of the 12 were good. We would say one fish was bad. And we know who that was. That was Judas, who betrayed Jesus. And so, parallel to the world, just because you drug in a bunch of fish out of the net, well, not every fish was edible and was good. Sometimes you'd even pull in dead fish with the good ones. And so we're not surprised that as Jesus went about selecting his disciples and catching them, there's one bad one in the bunch. But here is one question it raises for us. Jesus, as the great fisher of men, he is actually going to use a message in training them so that they can have a message to go out and catch. Here is the question that we have to ask as we go through Matthew. What is the message that is going to be used to catch men when we find ourselves in the role of being fishers of men for this thing called discipleship? Also, there's something else implicit in this that I find really fascinating. What's another goal for catching fish? Well, you want them to end up on your table. Friday night, when I was with the group at school, the president of our school, he paid for everybody's dinner. You know what I had Friday night? I had grilled salmon with tartar sauce on top of it, coleslaw. Oh, well, there's certain kinds of fish when it's cooked right. Oh, it's just so good. And you may have your favorite kind of fish, or you may not like fish at all. But the goal for the fisherman is to get that fish on the table so it can be eaten. We have to ask the question then, what's one of the purposes of being fishers of men? When all of us are involved in the discipleship process, reaching out to others, do you realize, because we've already studied the book of Revelation, so we understand this. Remember the image toward the end of the book of all of God's people at the meal or the supper of God. And some people call that the end time banquet table, that we're in heaven, feasting at that heavenly banquet. Well, in a sense, when we're in the role of fishers of men, when we catch people, guess what we're wanting? Our ultimate thinking in our brain is that we want them to end up at the banquet table in heaven. So that's part of the goal. The second thing is, what does it mean to follow Jesus? When Jesus saw Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew, they were casting a net. He says, "Come, follow me." What does that mean? Come, follow me. We may be surprised that they followed him so quickly. What I've often wondered, because it's not in the story, when Jesus saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, guess what? They were in the boat with their father, and when he asked them to come and follow, they get up and leave. I've often wondered, what did the father say? Would he have said something to them? Boys, where do you think you're going? We're right in the middle here of mending and preparing our nets. Where are you going? And it's interesting. We're going to talk about the condition of the call. But discipleship begins with hearing this direct command, "Come, follow me." And what he said to these four guys, "I will make you to become fishers of men. There is this making and forming process that was important for Jesus as he worked with his disciples. If you really want to read a book that really goes into detail about this, it's really fascinating. There is an English author named A.B. Bruce. He wrote a book many years, probably 50 years ago. But when it came out, it was kind of like a big splash for all the churches. It was called The Training of the 12. And he goes through the four gospels and he looks really in depth. What did Jesus do when he trained his disciples? It's very in depth. I think it's really good, but it makes you aware this was not an overnight thing. And this may be why I think in the past we've had a little bit of distorted view of what carrying out the Great Commission is. Because notice in Matthew 28, Jesus says, go into all the world and do what? Well, what we tend to think is just baptize people. Well, that's part of it, but that's not the main verb. How it's worded is, I want you to go into all the world and make disciples. Guess what? Making a disciple, being involved in that process, like Jesus made disciples, takes time. It takes time. And all I have to do is say this for you to reflect. How long has it taken you in your Christian life as a disciple to get where you are? To get to the point that you understand things as you do? How long is it going to take a person who first hears the gospel to come to the point where they're ready to follow and hear the voice of Jesus? Sometimes it takes a long time. These two songs that we sang, they were really powerful. I think I want to refer to them in a second. A number of years ago, I got to hear Charles Hodge in Duncanville, Texas. He was speaking at a big lectureship. And he said there were people in his church and other churches around him that were complaining, we're not making disciples like we ought to. And Larry's prayer all the time, I love it. Help us, Lord, grow in number. But what does that really mean? And Charles Hodge said, the problem often is we go out in the field with the combine, and we haven't even gone out with the planter to plant the corn first. And I want you to think about that image. We end up in the field with the combine and nothing out there because we haven't planted first. What we have to take seriously, and I noticed in the song, both of those songs that we sang pick up on this. It is so important. I mean, more than we ever realized, to intentionally plant the seed. I think what we've done through the years is made ourselves feel guilty because we didn't baptize somebody. But that's such a small part of discipleship. You got to plant first. Don't expect a harvest as there not been any seed planting. We need to hear this, okay? So the wonderful question for us as we think about this model, if that's true, Lord, how can I do some seed sowing today? That's my question. And that seed sowing was picked up in one of these songs. I don't know if you noticed it. Every time we sing this song, it really touches me because I know the truth. I've seen it through the years. I want to highlight it again. We need to hear it again. Okay, it was in the first song. Let me go back to the first one, and that number was Rescue the Perishing. Yeah, 439. If you have your songbooks and you want to turn to this, you got to hear this. This is amazing. And again, this is something we tend to forget. But the author in this song picks up on it in such a powerful way. It is verse 3. I am so glad that this verse is in here. Number 439, Rescue the Perishing. Look at verse 3. Down in the human heart, crushed by the tempter. So, let's look at this. Why are more people not receptive to the gospel like we would wish they would be? Because Satan's been at work. And we need to hear that. Satan has been successful in the lives of a lot of people, and he's been at work. But listen to the rest of this verse. Feelings lie buried, that grace can restore. The grace of God can do something that nothing else can do to the human heart. Also, touched by a loving hand, wakened by kindness. Man, we need to hear this. Sometimes the only thing that's going to touch a heart that has been crushed by Satan is the loving touch and words of kindness that people don't expect. It makes them sit up and take notice. And listen to how the rest of it ends. Touched by a loving hand, wakened by kindness, cords that were broken, talk about heart cords that were broken will vibrate once more. God's grace, only God's grace can do that. Mediated through us with words of kindness and touched by a loving hand. Man, is that powerful or what? Through the years, I just can't get over that verse because I think it's something we've overlooked. And I think it gets at the heart of sowing the seed of the kingdom. And if we can just remember that the loving, kind things you do for people, and especially toward people that are not Christians, don't think it's wasted time. You are sowing seed for eternity, and you're letting God's grace do the work to vibrate a heart that Satan thought he crushed forever. Wow. This always gives me goosebumps when I talk about it. This is powerful stuff. We need to hear it more. Okay? Now, let's continue. This is precisely what Jesus is trying to teach Peter and John and others. Following Jesus may mean we don't know where we're being taken. Come follow me. They didn't know where they were going. He didn't give them an itinerary. He didn't give them an iPhone and say, okay, here's the GPS, and just follow me. Don't get lost. Listen to John 21, because Jesus gets to the heart of this following. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, well, feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, well, tend my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Well, Peter was grieved. Probably the better word is exasperated. He kind of put out like, you've asked me the third time. He said, you know, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you. And then Jesus said, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted to go. But now you're old. You'll stretch out your hands and another person will dress you and carry you where you don't want to go. And he said this to show by what kind of death he was to glorify this. And after he said this to Peter, he said to him again, follow me. Peter got the instruction twice in his journey of discipleship. At the beginning, follow me. And then at the end, Jesus comes to Peter again and re-emphasizes that call to following. More than any other book in the New Testament and any other gospel, Matthew 26 times talks about following. Mark 21, Luke 23, John 18 times. So you get about 75 times in the New Testament with the Gospels, this idea of following after Jesus. And when we get to chapter 8, the question of the cost of following Jesus is going to be addressed in the case of a scribe and another disciple who came to Jesus and wanted to follow him. But it is clear, when we get to chapter 8, it is clear they did not count the cost and what priorities must be addressed before they could follow him. They had all of their priorities mixed up. Notice that these disciples in chapter 4 of Matthew responded immediately. It may seem strange for us to walk away that quickly, but it seems that when individuals are confronted with the voice of Jesus, come and follow me, there is an expectation of immediate response. Not saying, well, let me wait for a while. I hear you, but I'll make a decision next year. We get a lot of that in our school with adults. Sometimes I feel sorry for our director of admissions. She works so hard, and she'll get someone ready to come into school, and they've paid everything, and they're all lined up. And then at the last minute, the class should start, the person said, well, I made the decision, but I think I'm going to wait till next year. Well, for discipleship, you don't approach it like that. When you come to know what God is asking of you, you make the decision immediately. So much so, this is fascinating too. Do you realize in the book of Acts, when a person came to that decision, they also didn't wait for baptism? And that's interesting, because a lot of religious traditions will do that. A person wants to be a Christian, they'll say yes, say, well, several months down the road, we'll have a baptism Sunday, and we'll wait for them to baptize you. But if you look at Acts, you don't ever find a situation where they say, why don't you just put it off? No, it's always immediately following the person's coming to the Lord and that decision to follow.
Amen.
So we need to be aware of that. It's important. We need to know that their response may have been rooted, and it looks like it was, in their prior ideas of joining a messianic movement that had political overtones. I believe that the initial following of these four guys, they thought they were following something else. Jesus had to take 3.5 years to train them to think differently of what they grew up expecting. Reason we know that, all you have to do is look at Acts chapter 1. He is standing on the outside of the brow of Jerusalem, ready to go up into heaven, and of all questions they could have asked him. See, they could have asked, say, Jesus, you've been with us 3.5 years. Could you please give us power? We realize how inadequate we are for the task, but could you please give us power to be the kind of fishermen that you want us to be, because you've spent 3.5 years with us? That's not what they ask. Jesus, will you at this time restore to us the kingdom of Israel? And I wish we had it on video. I could almost see Jesus going, to ask that question after 3.5 years with them. Oh, so when they immediately respond, here's what is so neat about that. I want you to think about this too. When a person responds and becomes a Christian, do they know everything about the Christian life? Do they know everything about Jesus? Actually, who does? But think of how little a new convert knows when they come to Jesus and say, I want to follow Jesus, I want to be baptized. Well, think about your own life. Did you know back then when you became a Christian what you know today? Well, of course not. But isn't it beautiful to realize that that seed was planted in your heart, and it was a little fledgling seed that poked out of the ground, faith-wise, and it took years to grow. And that's what happens. And you see it here with us. He is willing to work with 12 guys who don't get it at the outcome. Not only that, there's all kinds of infighting later on among the 12. There's still all kinds of wrong ideas. Jesus could have said, and I've often said this, if he could have stepped back at about 2/3 of the way through, like year number 2, and looked at those 12 disciples and said, I think I picked the wrong 12. These guys are not getting it. He said, I'm going to start over and pick 12 more. He doesn't. The grace of God working through Jesus stuck with them. Now, after he is crucified and raised from the dead, even in the Gospel of John, later it says, after his resurrection, then they thought back and it made sense. So the aha moments began to come when the beginning of the church began and then they were out preaching the risen Lord, I could imagine all the light bulbs that started coming on them that they had no clue even when they were with him. Matthew 16:12. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And in chapter 17, then the disciples understood he was speaking to them about John the Baptist. Sometimes it took a little while for them to get to the point that they understood, but that was okay. In order to follow Jesus, we may have to leave something. And this is going to be very particular in every person's case. It is true, and I've seen this through the years, that there have been adults who became Christians, recognized that the profession that they're involved in was so antithetical to the words of Jesus and his mission, they quit their job. They had to look for something else. They realized they had to give up certain friends. They had to leave. And it is fascinating to me that twice in this story of Jesus calling his first disciples, they left something. Now, here it looks pretty benign. I mean, they're actually in the middle of their daily work. In the middle of their daily work, they leave. And it may not be for us that we have to literally leave our home and our business, but there is a type of leaving your prior life that is not a walk of discipleship. In fact, later on in Matthew 19:27, Peter's starting to get it, and he asked this question. Peter said to Jesus, "See, Jesus, we've left everything and follow you. Now, what will you give us?" He's like, okay, yeah, I looked around. I left my father's business. I'm not a fisherman anymore. I've walked with you all this time. I've left all these plans for my life. And then, okay, Jesus, since we left here, then what are you going to give us? Well, Jesus still has to work on Peter. And when we get to chapter 19, we'll work on that. Because 2 verses later, it's not until toward the end of Matthew that Jesus does promise a reward, but listen to what he says. Everyone who has left houses or mothers or brothers or sisters or father or lands for my sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. We're giving up some worldly things. When we become a disciple of Jesus, there is a leaving. There's a reward. It's going to make it all worth it. Last of all, this discipleship occurs for these 4 guys, and I'm going to talk a moment about the implication for discipleship today. It's in the midst of mending nets. So they're mending their nets. And let's not ignore the fact that they're called to discipleship in the midst of living life, their daily tasks. They were mending their nets. The word for mending here, mending the nets, is a word that's precisely used, pretty fascinating, by Luke in his gospel, talking about, I'll just read the verse and I'll tell you. Luke 6:40. A pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. This word mending nets is used in this verse to talk about the full preparation and training of a disciple who can be like his teacher. So think about what happens when fishermen got those kind of nets that we talked about. You're going to have to prepare them to get ready to go back out. Sometimes it is mending. Sometimes, it's unraveling the net. Maybe it got in such a bad shape, you had to sort of try to get it out again so you could use it. So there's a time of preparation getting the net ready, and that's the word that is used by Luke. Listen to 1 Peter 5:10. And after you suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. So this idea of strengthening or preparing or getting you ready to live the kind of life is what God is going to do for you. But Peter, and we don't have time to develop this, Peter attaches it to suffering. Did you know that suffering prepares us to be a faithful disciple? And we don't like to hear that. I don't want to hear that. Here's what I'd rather. the blessings of life and life being so good really prepares me to be a disciple. And I don't have any problems. That's not what this verse says. Suffering. Okay. Now, as we've learned this then, discipleship in the midst of mending nets. And as we close then, I want us to think about how crucial it is to be fishers of men. That we are on a journey of discipleship and it never ends. And at the same time, we're sowing seeds as disciples. We find ourselves in the role, in whatever way that God's given us, using opportunities to use words of kindness, to reach out with a loving touch, to touch someone's life on behalf of Jesus. People who don't know him, don't see him, they need to know him and see him through us. And it's that planting that we have to always be faithful to. It's not up to us to produce. Remember what Paul said? This is the biblical model. Paul said, I planted, who watered? Remember? Apollos, who gave the increase. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. Where God does not give increase, there is no harvest. Where we've done no planting of seed, there is no harvest. Where there's no watering and training, there is no harvest. All of that has to work together. That's why I am so convinced that, in a way, we kind of missed it in the past. I don't mind saying this. I know of good intention, but there was so much unnecessary guilt heaped on people in the congregation. You as an individual, there's something wrong with you if you haven't baptized at least one person this week. And people would just about come out and say that. So what do? We walk around with this big cloud of guilt, and who wants to hear our cloud of guilt? If all I'm going to offer people is a cloud of guilt, they're not up for that. They got enough problems in their own life. What we offer people is a life of joy so that all of us in the body of Christ, with our gifts and who we are, we're going to be planting in different ways. We're going to be nurturing other people in different ways. And some of us may be present. I wish that the church through the years had always been present at every baptism that I performed, because it wasn't my work. In fact, it would be interesting if I could go back and ever make a note of this. How many people came to baptism and they said, it wasn't anything you said, but it's what so-and-so in the congregation said. So for the preacher, that deflates his ego. Oh, man, I can't mark that one up for me. But guess what? It's not about the preacher anyway. We're all involved in this, And we just need to be aware of what I call a healthy life of discipleship that enjoys sharing the word and planting it in the way that God gives us. Because when that's a joyful thing as God's people, we don't mind doing it. We're excited to do it. And not only that, when we sing that song, Rescue the Perishing, boy, you talk about giving an urgency to whatever we can do to the glory of God. We recognize, yes, there are people perishing, and I'm here to do whatever I can. Count on me. So anyway, I could go on all day. I won't. This is great stuff in Matthew. I hope you're enjoying it like I am.